In the Global Slavery Index of 2018, victims of human trafficking in the Philippines spiked to over 700,000. This places our nation in the 12th rank among countries with the highest incidence of modern-day slavery in the entire Asia Pacific. Human trafficking is a prevalent social issue, which is only given a little attention in the communities. Most of the people are either not aware that this matter is a breach of an individual's right, or that there is a remedy they can avail of. Unfortunately, not all of the people know that this is unlawful and unjust, which has an equivalent penalty or sanction. Thus, our goal for today is to present it in the simplest and most understandable manner possible on how we can put an end to this, with the hopes that this will encourage you to reach out to the helpless victims of human trafficking. Good day, everyone. We are now in the third segment of our report on special penal laws. I am Icy once again, your reporter for today's learning episode of Philippine Laws Dissected. Human trafficking, or trafficking in person, is broad. Hence, we need to begin by defining what this crime covers, which can be dissected into three parts: the act, means, and exploitative purpose. Under Republic Act No. 10364, expanding Republic Act No. 9208, or the Anti-Trafficking in Persons Act of 2003, human trafficking or trafficking in person refers to, first, the act which is the recruitment, obtaining, hiring, providing, offering, transportation, transfer, maintaining, harboring, or receipt of persons with or without the victim's consent or knowledge within or across national borders. Second, the means of threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power or of position, taking advantage of the vulnerability of the person, or the giving or receiving of payments or benefits, which is to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. Third, the exploitative purpose, which includes at a minimum: A, the exploitation or prostitution of others or other forms of sexual exploitation, forced labor or services, slavery or servitude, and the removal or sale of organs. It is important to note that this list is not exclusive. Thus, other forms of similar nature may be accepted to constitute exploitative purpose. To put it in perspective, when a woman who needed a job was offered to work in a restaurant in Malaysia, but was actually employed as a prostitute in a club when she was transported there, the Supreme Court charged the accused for qualified trafficking in persons committed by a syndicate, even with the presence of consent and knowledge of the victim. Prostitution, forced labor, slavery, involuntary servitude, sex tourism, sexual exploitation, debt bondage, and pornography are what constitute the crime of anti-trafficking in person. For the next segment of this episode, we will in-depthly talk more about these terms under this law. Let's first start with prostitution. Prostitution refers to any act, transaction, scheme, or design involving the use of a person by another for sexual intercourse or lascivious conduct in exchange for money, profit, or any other consideration. Prostitution, as defined under the Revised Penal Code, must be differentiated from that of prostitution under this special law. There are three distinct differences. Unlike prostitution, as defined in the Revised Penal Code, the element of habituality, indulging in sexual intercourse or lascivious conduct, is not required in Republic Act 9208. As to gender, Article 202 is specific with women, while Republic Act No. 9208 does not distinguish. In terms of liability, as a rule, the trafficked and child prostitute do not incur criminal liability because they are recognized as victims. However, if the child is neither trafficked nor a child prostitute, then she can be held liable under Article 202 of the Revised Penal Code. Customers, as well, who take the services of these prostitutes are punished. If the victim is a child prostitute, the customer is held liable under Republic Act No. 7610 because of Section 5, Paragraph A, which penalizes those who engage in or promote, facilitate, or induce child prostitution, and Paragraph B, which penalizes those who commit the act of sexual intercourse or lascivious conduct with a child exploited in prostitution or subjected to other sexual abuse. If the child is under 12 years of age and rape is committed, the customer shall be held liable under Article 335, Paragraph 3 of the Revised Penal Code. If the child is under 12 years of age and lascivious conduct is committed, the customer shall be liable under Article 336 of the Revised Penal Code, but the penalty will be prison temporal in its medium period and not prison correctional due to the amendment of Act No. 3815. If the victim is neither trafficked nor a child prostitute, liability falls under Article 202 of the Revised Penal Code for vagrancy, not under Republic Act 9208 or Republic Act No. 7610. Second, we have the term forced labor. So forced labor refers to the extraction of work or services from any person by means of enticement, violence, intimidation or threat, use of force or coercion, including the deprivation of freedom, abuse of authority, moral ascendancy, death, bondage, deception, including any work or services extracted from any person under the menace of penalty. So third, we have slavery. So slavery refers to the status of condition of a person over whom any or all of the powers attaching to the right of ownership are exercised. So fourth, we have the term involuntary servitude. So this refers to a condition of enforced and compulsory service, induced by means of any scheme or pattern or plan, intended to cause a person to believe that if she or he did not enter into or continue in such condition, he or she or another person would suffer serious harm or other forms of abuse or physical restraint or threat of abuse or harm or coercion, including the deprivation of access to travel documents and withholding salaries, or the abuse or threatened abuse of the legal process. The offender of these forms of human trafficking may be liable under Republic Act No. 9208 or under Article 272 or slavery of the Revised Penal Code. So fifth, we have sex tourism. So this refers to a program organized by travel and tourism-related establishments and individuals, which consist of tourism packages or activities utilizing and offering escort and sexual services as enticement for tourists. So this includes sexual services and practices offered during rest and recreation periods for members of the military. So when sexual services and practices are offered during rest and recreation periods for members of the military and the victim engages in prostitution with any member of the military or law enforcement agencies, the crime is qualified. The crime is done for the purpose of utilizing and offering persons for prostitution, pornography, or sexual exploitation. Tourists need not actually avail of the services of the trafficked victim. The crime is consummated as long as sex tourism is organized. Sixth, we have sexual exploitation, which refers to participation by a person in prostitution, pornography or the production of pornography in exchange for money, profit, or any other consideration, or where the participation is caused or facilitated by any means of intimidation or threat, use of force, or other forms of coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, debt, bondage, abuse of power, or of position or of legal process, taking advantage of the vulnerability of the person, or giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another, or in sexual intercourse or lascivious conduct caused or facilitated by any means as provided in this act. So seventh, we have debt bondage. This refers to the pledging by the debtor of his or her personal services or labor, or those of a person under his or her control, as security or payment for a debt, when the length and nature of services is not clearly defined, or when the value of the services as reasonably assessed is not applied toward the liquidation of the debt. The holder of the debt slaves may also be prosecuted under Republic Act No. 9208 or under Article 274 for renders rendered under compulsion of payment of debt in the Revised Penal Code. Forcing a child to work due to debt bondage is one of the worst forms of child labor. Thus, the offender may be held liable for the crime of trafficking in persons and or under Article 273, exploitation of child labor. But trafficked or child beggars are not liable under the crime of mendicancy because they are treated as victims under Republic Act No. 9208. Lastly, we have pornography. This refers to any representation through publication, exhibition, cinematography, indecent shows, information technology, or by whatever means of a person engaged in real or simulated explicit sexual activities, or any representation of the sexual parts of a person for primarily sexual purposes. To test whether a show, exhibition, or material is obscene, the Supreme Court came up with a guideline in Miller v. California, which are whether to the average person applying contemporary standard would find the work taken as a whole appeal to the prurient interest, whether the work depicts or describes in a patently offensive way sexual conduct specifically defined by the applicable state law, and whether the work taken as a whole lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. It is important to take note that nudity per se is not pornographic. However, if the purpose for such nudity is sexual, then it becomes pornographic under the contemplation of Republic Act No. 9208. Under Republic Act No. 9208, the acts of any person, natural or juridical, becomes unlawful when it's done in the following ways. So we have 11 ways. First, to recruit, obtain, hire, provide, offer, transport, transfer, harbor, provide, or receive a person by any means, including those done under the pretext of domestic or overseas employment or training or apprenticeship for the purpose of prostitution, pornography, sexual exploitation, forced labor, slavery, involuntary servitude, or debt bondage. Second is to introduce or match for money, profit, or material, economic, or other consideration any person, or as provided under Republic Act No. 6955, any Filipino woman to a foreign national for marriage for the purpose of either acquiring, buying, offering, selling, or trading him or her to engage in prostitution, pornography, sexual exploitation, forced labor, slavery, involuntary servitude, or debt bondage. Its elements are: first, the offender introduces or matches for money, profit, or material, economic, or other consideration a person or a Filipino woman to a foreign national for marriage. And second, that the victim can either be a Filipino or a foreigner. Third, that the offender must match or introduce to a foreign national. If matched or introduced to a Filipino citizen, there is no liability. Fourth, the purpose is to acquire, buy, offer, sell, or trade the trafficked person to engage in prostitution, pornography, sexual exploitation, forced labor, slavery, involuntary servitude, or debt bondage. And fifth, an additional element is that one or more of the means listed in Section 3, Paragraph A must be present, except in cases involving minors. Third is to offer or contract marriage, real or simulated, for the purpose of acquiring, buying, offering, selling, or trading them to engage in prostitution, pornography, sexual exploitation, forced labor or slavery, involuntary servitude, or debt bondage. Its elements are: first, the offender offers or contracts marriage, real or simulated. Second, celebration of marriage is not required. Proposal or offer is sufficient. Third, validity of marriage is not required. Fourth, its purpose is to acquire, buy, offer, sell, or trade the trafficked victim to engage in prostitution, pornography, sexual exploitation, forced labor or slavery, involuntary servitude, or debt bondage. Fifth, actual exploitation is not required. Mere marriage proposal or marrying for exploitative purpose consummates the crime. And lastly, an additional element is that one or more of the means listed in Section 3, Paragraph A must be present, except in cases involving minors. The fourth punishable act is to undertake or organize tours and travel plans consisting of tourism packages or activities for the purpose of utilizing and offering persons for prostitution, pornography, or sexual exploitation. Its elements are that first, the offender undertakes or organizes tours and travel plans consisting of tourism packages or activities. Second, an additional element is that one or more of the means listed in Section 3, Paragraph A must be present, except in cases involving minors. Liability generally falls only upon the organizers of the sex tourism. However, tourists may be liable under this law for conspiracy. The fifth punishable act is to maintain or hire a person to engage in prostitution or pornography. Its elements are: first, that the offender maintains or hires a trafficked person. Second, maintains includes pimps, which are persons who provide gratification for the lust of others. Pimps are punishable under Article 202 of the Revised Penal Code if trafficked person is an adult. On the other hand, if the victim is a child, then he is liable under Republic Act No. 7610. Pimps may be liable under this law when they continuously maintain a trafficked person. Moreover, if that person is a child, then the crime is deemed qualified. The third element is to arrange for the labor or services of another person for a stipulated compensation. If a trafficked person receives monthly compensation, the crime is trafficking in persons. With regard to the employer-employee relationship is not essential. Fourth, the purpose is to engage the trafficked person in prostitution or pornography. Actual engagement is not necessary. Mere hiring consummates the crime. And lastly, an additional element is that one or more of the means listed in Section 3, Paragraph A must be present, except in cases involving minors. The sixth punishable act is to adopt persons by any form of consideration for exploitative purposes, or to facilitate the same for the purposes of prostitution, pornography, sexual exploitation, forced labor, slavery, involuntary servitude, or debt bondage. It requires that the offender adopts or facilitates the adoption of a trafficked person. If adoption is primarily intended for an exploitative purpose, the crime is punished under Republic Act 9208. If the adopted is convicted by final judgment under Republic Act 9208, the adoption decree is rescinded. If a pregnant mother consents to the adoption for a consideration, the crime is attempted child trafficking under Section 8 of Republic Act 7610. If the child is bought for a valuable consideration, the crime is consummated child trafficking under Section 7 of Republic Act 7610. This is regardless if the offender subsequently executed a judicial adoption of the child. Its purpose is prostitution, pornography, sexual exploitation, forced labor, slavery, involuntary servitude, or debt bondage. The seventh act is to adopt or facilitate the adoption of persons for the purpose of prostitution, pornography, sexual exploitation, forced labor, slavery, involuntary servitude, or debt bondage. The eighth punishable act is to recruit, hire, adopt, transport, obtain, harbor, maintain, provide, offer, receive, or abduct a person by means of threat or use of force, fraud, deceit, violence, coercion, or intimidation for the purpose of removal or sale of organs of said person. Its elements are that first, the offender recruits, hires, abducts, transports, or abducts a trafficked person. Second, that it is by means of threat or use of force, fraud, deceit, violence, coercion, or intimidation. And third, that the purpose is to remove or the sale of the organs. Fourth, that any of the means enumerated must be present, since removal or sale of organs is not a crime per se. An example of fraud is when the offender conceals the long-term effect of kidney removal to induce the victim to remove or sell his or her kidney. The ninth punishable act is to recruit, transport, obtain, transfer, harbor, maintain, offer, hire, provide, receive, or adopt a child to engage in armed activities in the Philippines or abroad. Compulsory recruitment of a child is punishable under Republic Act 7610. Trafficking of children for purposes of engaging in armed activities is punishable under Republic Act 9208. This qualifies the crime. The 10th punishable act is to recruit, transport, transfer, harbor, obtain, maintain, offer, hire, provide, or receive a person by means in Section 3 of this act for purposes of forced labor, slavery, debt bondage, and involuntary servitude, including a scheme, plan, or pattern intended to cause the person either to first believe that if the person did not perform such labor of services, he or she or another person would suffer serious harm or physical restraint, or second, to abuse or threaten the use of law or the legal process. And lastly, the 11th punishable act is to recruit, transport, harbor, obtain, transfer, maintain, hire, offer, provide, adopt, or receive a child for purposes of exploitation or trading them, including but not limited to the act of buying and or selling a child for any consideration or for barter or for purposes of exploitation. Trafficking for purposes of exploitation of children shall include, first, all forms of slavery or practices similar to slavery, involuntary servitude, debt bondage, and forced labor, including recruitment of children for use in armed conflict. Second, the use, procuring, or offering of a child for prostitution, for the production of pornography, or for pornographic performances. Third, the use, procuring, or offering of a child for the production and trafficking of drugs. And lastly, the use, procuring, or offering of a child for illegal activities or work, which by its nature or the circumstances in which it is carried out, is likely to harm their health, safety, or morals. It is important to take note that even if there are acts enumerated which are not mentioned under the definition of trafficking in person in Section 3, Paragraph A, The prohibited acts under Section 4 are within the context of Section 3, Paragraph A. There is trafficking in person even if the element of means is lacking when the trafficked person is a child. Any person, whether a man or woman, may be a victim of human trafficking as the law does not specify the gender. A child who is under 18 years old or one who is over 18 but is unable to fully take care of or protect himself or herself from abuse, neglect, cruelty, exploitation, or discrimination because of a physical or mental disability or condition can also be a victim, provided that the child is recruited, transported, transferred, harbored, abducted, or received by another person for a purpose of exploitation, or when the adoption is induced by any form of consideration for exploitative purposes, even in the absence of the means discussed. In Section 4, under Republic Act No. 10364, any person, natural or juridical, can be prosecuted for human trafficking, so long as they perform the unlawful acts under this special law. Republic Act No. 9208 was amended by Republic Act No. 10364 with a purpose to expand the coverage of the law. In RA 10364, the victims are afforded protection from any retaliatory suits and in such a way that their past sexual behavior or reputation cannot be used against them. Furthermore, an affidavit of desistance is not a ground for dismissal of the case. A penalty of 15 years of imprisonment shall be imposed on persons who shall induce the victim to execute an affidavit of desistance or not to participate in investigation or in the prosecution of the case. Aside from the victims, the stakeholders who are in the performance of their regular duties or functions, whether as a law enforcement or as a social worker, or any person authorized by the law enforcer or social worker to give assistance to locate the victim for the purposes of investigation or prosecution of the case, are immune from suits. Republic Act No. 10364 deemed attempted trafficking in persons the following acts. First, facilitating the travel of a child alone to a foreign country or territory without valid reason and without the necessary clearance or permit from DSWD, or a written permit or justification from the parent or legal guardian. Second, executing an affidavit or consent for adoption for a consideration. Third, for purposes of selling the child, one either recruits a woman to bear a child, simulates birth of a child, or solicits a child and acquires custody through any means from among hospitals, clinics, nurseries, daycare centers, refugee or evacuation centers, and low-income families for the purpose of selling the child. Furthermore, Republic Act No. 10364 introduced new provisions on the law, mainly on the liability of an accomplice and accessory, creation of anti-trafficking in persons database, temporary custody of trafficked victims, irrelevance of past sexual disposition of victims, immunity from suit of the stakeholders, extraterritorial jurisdiction, which recognizes the offense as a continuing crime, and lastly, additional funds for the Interagency Council Against Trafficking, which shall come from the penalties, fines, or assets derived from any violation. There are also additional penalties under Republic Act No. 10364, such as those imposed for attempted trafficking in persons, which is imprisonment for 15 years plus a fine of 500,000 but not more than 1 million, and those imposed for an accomplice and accessory, similar for attempted trafficking in persons. Additionally, penalties imposed for customers of prostitutes are way higher than that provided under Republic Act 9208. Under Republic Act 9208, for the first offense, the offender shall render 6 months community service plus a fine of 50,000 pesos. For the second offense, the offender shall suffer 1 year imprisonment plus a fine of 100,000 pesos. Whereas, in Republic Act No. 10364, the offender shall suffer 6 to 12 years of imprisonment, plus a fine of not less than 50,000 pesos, but not more than 100,000 pesos. But if the prostitute is a minor, regardless if that said minor is a trafficking victim, the customer shall suffer 40 years of imprisonment with no parole, plus a fine of not less than 1 million pesos, but not more than 5 million pesos. If the customer knows the prostitute is indeed a trafficking victim, then the customer shall suffer the same penalty for acts in trafficking in persons, that is, a 20-year imprisonment plus a fine of not less than 1 million pesos, but not more than 2 million pesos. If the customer knows a qualifying circumstance, then the said customer shall suffer the same penalty for qualified trafficking, that is, life imprisonment, plus a fine of not less than 2 million pesos, but not more than 5 million pesos. For a foreigner customer, he or she shall be deported or barred from entering the country. For a public official customer, he or she shall be dismissed from service to suffer perpetual absolute disqualification, plus any fine or imprisonment under any provision of Republic Act 10364. These penalties shall be imposed if, first, the offender is a juridical person, owner, president, partner, manager, or any other responsible officer who participated or have knowingly permitted or failed to prevent its commission and will not be allowed to operate similar establishments in a different name. The registration with the Securities Exchange Commission shall also be cancelled and revoked. Second, foreigner offenders. Third, government employees or agencies who issue travel exit clearances, passport, and the likes. And lastly, adopters. Anti-trafficking in person is considered qualified when, first, the trafficked person is a child. Second, if an intercountry adoption was for any of the exploitative purposes, except for sale of organs. Third, if it is committed either by a syndicate, that is a group of 3 or more persons conspiring with one another, or in a large scale by 3 or more persons individually or as a group. Fourth, the offender is a spouse, ascendant, parent, sibling, guardian, or a person who exercises authority over the trafficked person, or when the offense is committed by a public officer or employee. Fifth, the trafficked person is recruited to engage in prostitution with any member of the military or law enforcement agencies. Sixth, offender is a member of the military or the law enforcement agencies. Seventh, when by reason or on occasion of the act of trafficking in persons, the offended party dies, becomes insane, suffers mutilation, or is afflicted with HIV or AIDS. This is only exclusive only to HIV/AIDS, otherwise it's not qualified. 8. Offender commits 1 or more acts of trafficking for 60 or more days, whether those days are continuous or not. And lastly, 9. Offender directs or through another manages the trafficking victim in carrying out the exploitative purposes of trafficking. The highest penalty, that is life imprisonment plus a fine of not less than 2 million pesos, but not more than 5 million pesos, shall be imposed for qualified trafficking in persons. Now, removal or sale of organs includes the recruiting, hiring, abducting, transporting, and abducting of victim for the purpose of the sale or removal of such organs. However, donation of organs is allowed after the death of the donor in accordance with Republic Act No. 7170. In order to avoid confusion, there is a need for us to distinguish the crime of trafficking in persons from that of illegal recruitment and human smuggling. There are 4 distinct differences between these crimes. First, in trafficking in persons, it may not or may not involve coercion, fraud, deception, abuse of vulnerability, and etc. In legal recruitment, it usually does not involve coercion, but uses more deception, promises, and fraud. And human smuggling, on the other hand, usually does not involve coercion. Second, trafficking in person is characterized by subsequent exploitation, after the legal entry of one person from one place to another or from one country to another. While in illegal recruitment, it is characterized by facilitating entry of one person from one country to another through an unorganized or unlicensed agency. In human smuggling, on the other hand, is characterized by facilitating for a fee the illegal entry of a person into a foreign country. Third, in trafficking, there is a need to prove the presence of exploitation, or that the recruitment was facilitated for the purpose of exploitation, whereas in illegal recruitment, mere recruitment without license is already punishable. There's no need to prove the consequential exploitation. In human smuggling, on the other hand, there should be proof of illegal entry by non-compliance with the necessary requirements for travel. Fourth, trafficking in person is considered a human rights issue, while both illegal recruitment and human smuggling are considered a migration concern. It is now 2020, yet the fight against human trafficking still persists. But what can we do, you might ask? Here are practical steps we can provide that may help you help others as well. First, be vigilant and watch out if there are any suspicious incidents likely to human trafficking in your community. Second, speak up. Use your knowledge and voice to educate others. Third, report any leads to proper authorities and lend a hand to the victims. You may never know that you have already saved a life. And we hope that you have learned something from today's episode. This has been your reporter IC for Philippine Laws Dissected. Thanks so much for watching.